Okay, I think we should start. I'd like to welcome Andrew Benjamin, who has often spoken here, but whose architectural theory is freshened by his recent triumphs at Columbia. He's going to give a talk entitled Building Philosophy Towards the Theory of Architecture, in which he will examine the ways of connecting the projects of philosophy and architecture, utilizing the theory of complexity developed in his book, The Plural Event. Drawing on the work of Bataille and of Blanchot, the lecture will work within a frame of reference in which the concerns of philosophy and architecture inform each other. As probably most of you know, Andrew Benjamin is director of the Center of Research in Research in Philosophy and Literature at the University of Warwick, and his published works include The Plural Event, published by Routledge, Object Painting, published by Academy Editions, and What is Abstraction, which is a forthcoming book published by Academy Editions. Andrew is also the editor of the Journal of Philosophy and the Visual Arts. So it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening Andrew Benjamin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here at the AA, and the paper I'm going to give today is really an attempt to take up yet again the way in which philosophy and architecture could be connected or could come to be connected. I utilize a lot the work of Maurice Blanchot and Georges Bataille, as I say in the paper, not really as ends in themselves, but as to explore a specific problem, a specific possibility. And it's very simply this, though its ramifications are enormous. If we take the word architecture as containing two possibilities or two parts, one is a relationship between the arche and the other is the relationship between the tectonic, and say that the majority of architecture is articulated in terms of a tight and rigorous correspondence between the arche and the tectonic. The projects of early modernism are articulated within that. The question that interests me is twofold. What happens when that relationship becomes less exact, less precise? What sort of architecture does that open up? And secondly, there's the philosophical problem, though the first is equally a philosophical problem, of how you would think that an exact relationship or that less formal or loose relationship. This is in some sense what the paper is meant to explore. I start by referring to a paper by Maurice Blanchot written in 1964 called About Berlin. The story itself was already complicated. As a site, this particular moment of writing, this text called Berlin, turns round a place that, in resisting its own self-absorption, will open up the possibility that it may be the place par excellence. Maurice Blanchot, writing in 1964 about Berlin, describes it almost inevitably as yielding the problem of division. And yet with Berlin, the divisions came to be posed on three different levels: the political, the economic, and the philosophical. I mean, the virtue of taking Berlin as an example, as I'll say towards the end, is the problem of what happens when it was unified, or what happened when it was unified. Do we therefore have the unified and controlled city par excellence, or does its unification cause us to have to rethink what would be meant by a city that was given as having an already given unity? Prior to taking up the question of the division, taking up and allowing it thereby its own complication to generate that thinking of division that engenders complexity because it is sustained by it. It is essential to turn to another short text, indeed an emphatically short text, by Blanchot. In a letter addressed to Claire Nouvet and published under the title Enigma, Blanchot offers a brief commentary on Mallarmé, specifically on Mallarmé's reworking of Edgar Allan Poe's original formulation of the relationship between architecture and literature. Despite its own internal convolutions, this brief excursion will not just allow a return to Berlin, now the name of Blanchot's earlier text, but a return, a better return, a return now informed to two other places in which the relation architecture-philosophy seems to have been posed. Rather than delimiting their detail at this stage, in this instance these places can be provisionally identified as the body and the urban. Already these terms, body and urban, bring with them the problem of metaphors and thus language. After all, does the body in question involve a literal presence or mere phrasing? It is worth noting that the body, in being a site of calculation as well as order, was never just a metaphor. And I make this point because a great deal of the writing about the relationship between philosophy and architecture has been very concerned with the presence of differing forms of language, as though what was at stake were forms of language. And what I want to note here is that the relationship between the body and architecture was never just a metaphor. This point comes to be repeated throughout architectural treatises. Not only is this point made clearly by Vitruvius in De Architectura, it inheres in his actual mode of expression. Rather than the work of metaphors, the body and the building have an analogical relation. And I quote Vitruvius, as in the human body, from cubit, foot, palm, inch, and other small parts comes the symmetric quality of eurythmy. So it is in the completed building. So as in the body, so it is in the building. The relationship is an analogical relationship. One is not a metaphor for the other. Not only will the problem of the body endure, the question of its involving no more than language, metaphors, and thus the retention of a specific vocabulary will have become more demanding. Thinking this relation, philosophy and architecture, will involve thinking it through, and thus through, the work of language. What would need to be pursued, therefore, is how the analogy works. Hence, what would return would be the question of the body. Taken as an end in itself, the body will have never been enough. It will always have been more than itself. And it's precisely these sorts of considerations that can be brought to our thinking of the urban, as I'll indicate later on. Now, returning to the letter in question, within it Blanchot's task was to examine the possible priority attributed to the ethical within any thinking of literature. Mallarmé is used, first of all, to offer the possibility of what he calls a magical architecture, which, whilst having rules, these rules remain unknown. In Mallarmé's terms, and I quote, these rules make themselves mysterious on purpose. Added to this already difficult possibility is the further claim that the Mallarméan endeavour, that what holds the Mallarméan endeavour in place is a deviation from the evocation of rule and mystery, and the positing of an anteriority that is both prior and productive. And yet the presence of the rule, biding its time within an anteriority, rather than an external constraint, marks the presence for Blanchot not just of the interpretive difficulty of the work, Mallarmé's own problematic presence, but of his singularity as a poet. Blanchot is acutely aware of this problematic turn. Indeed, his laboured readings of Mallarmé have always been attentive to this issue. Within these readings, this anteriority emerges as what he calls le désœuvrement de l'être, the unworking of being. And this word, désœuvrement, is one of these delightful words that would be translatable if the French language contained the word œuvrement, which unfortunately it doesn't. But were it to hold it as a word, œuvrement would be translated as workful, as that which guided something. Hence it would be the arché par excellence. Désœuvrement, which the French language does contain, but which is difficult to translate, means the unworkful presence of something. But what is of interest to me is the idea that there could be something described as unworkful, which is productive, which is prior, and yet keeps on insisting even though there is work. And it's precisely this possibility, and I recognize the difficulty attached to this, but nonetheless it's this possibility that allows us to undertake the difficult job of thinking through the possibility of there being an arché, where the relationship between the arché and the tectonic is not a direct application, is not purely instructive, is not a purely generative relationship in which the arché exhausts itself in that which comes to presence. A productive anteriority that is measured by its désœuvrement is already a questioning, not of the arché itself, that would be too easy, but of the nature of the arché that is thought to inhere within architectural practice, though equally within the activity of philosophy. The question that arises will not concern having to establish the link between Blanchot, Mallarmé, and architecture. That would be a mere matter of application. Rather, it will touch on the possibility, perhaps the necessity, of thinking architecture once it has become possible to recast the productive presence of these points of inception. Guiding this thinking will be the demanding reality that once essential thinking is put to one side, and with the view of theory having become plural, and thus because its gaze falls on an unsettled site, unsettling the gaze itself, philosophy and architecture will shown to have been marked by an insistent irreducibility. It will insist, even though the repetition of tradition's own dominance has sought to preclude the productive inscription of that insistence. And what I mean by that is if you take the word theory seriously, as we should, if you take it à la lettre, as we should to begin with, then theory simply means that which accompanies an object, accompanies it while viewing the object. And it's at that particular point it becomes possible to ask the question, what is theory? Not because this is a meta-theoretical question, but because the question of theory already presupposes a relationship between a subject and an object. So the question of theory, if you like, is already overdetermined. It already exists as a problem that demands its own theoretical thinking through. Consequently, rather than a form of prevarication, beginning in this way opens up what is essential to the nature of theory. Theory is, as I've suggested, the delimitation both of gaze and of an object. It is thus that at stake here, both in Blanchot and elsewhere, is a play of limits. Neither the unlimited in itself, nor the limit as such, nor moreover a happy correspondence in which one worked to delimit the other. What is both difficult and yet fundamental at this point is the nature of the relationship between production and presence. And it seems to me this is one of the key problems in architectural theory, is the nature of the relationship between how one thinks production and then that which comes to be present, and how one connects the two. Of this complex setup, as it is formulated by Mallarmé, the poet, Blanchot offers the following comment. At its heart, in my view, lies the question of an architectural theory. And I quote, "One will understand, I hope, that if I speak of contradictions, it is better to experience their necessity, the pure surging from the source, and nevertheless the calculations which only act by slipping away, or the intellectual armature that composes itself, space, blank, silence, thus work and mastery, and nevertheless to contain what lightning of instinct, simply life, virgin in its synthesis and illuminating everything, innate and setting rules for itself, anterior and simply life, contradictions without conciliation. It is not a question of dialectics." End quote. Perhaps the opening question here should concern the nature of the relationship between work and mastery. While this is the central question, evoking as it does the intrusion of philosophy's own conception of the architect, a conception that stems from the conflation of God and architect in Hegel's shorter logic, to the description of the builder in Aristotle as always governed and regulated by the arche. It needs the setting provided by the difficult possibility of contradictions without conciliation. In general, contradictions become the identification of what, within the tradition of philosophical thinking, yields an intolerable state of affairs. Whether it is taken on the level of logic or present in the life world, contradiction will always demand a form of resolution. Resolution is conciliation. Here, of course, contradiction and paradox bring with them the very problems they seek to identify. And yet, contradiction, taken at its most elementary, is neither tolerable nor intolerable in itself. It is rather that contradictions demand resolution, demand an enforcing conciliation, once they are viewed as structured, either by the logic of identity or by the work of dialectics. Conciliation, its need and possibility, arise from this conception of work or this particular logic. Resolution is an effect. Consequently, to write, as Blanchot does, of contradictions without conciliation is not to posit an irresolvable setup given by the logic of identity or dialectics, but to allow for their abeyance, and thus the opening up of a situation in which contradiction and thus conciliation will demand other forms of thinking. This is precisely what Blanchot means when he states that of the envisaged situation, it is not a question of dialectics. The demanding problem here is, of course, of what is it a question. And what I'm doing at the moment is trying to work away at what happens when you take the idea of a controlling arche, an arche that controls the tectonic, and you want to argue on the one hand for a loose or sloppy, if I could use the word, relationship between the two, which has the inevitable consequence that the idea of a unified, dominating arche driving tectonic itself comes undone. And at that particular point, one can talk about what it is that architecture is in terms of how is it going to be thought, given that the standard means within philosophical thinking are no longer going to be appropriate. And as I'll say towards the end, though I can't argue it in detail here, this is not because of a mere philosophical argument. It's the way in which philosophy is forced to respond to the presence of contemporary architecture. Not all architecture, but certain forms of architecture that demand this sort of thinking. In responding to this demand, it is possible to effect a specific translation that involves a necessary return to the architectural. This will occur once the body is allowed to play an exemplary role within architectural thinking. It will be a role that is as much present within Vitruvius and Alberti as it is within more contemporary formulations of bodily presence. I mean, it is very interesting that if you look at the literature, if you look at Vitruvius, Alberti, Book 9, Section 7, that the relationship between the building and the body, or between architecture and the body, is continually established. If you look at more contemporary work, this relationship is still maintained, architecture and body. But it would be simply naive to think that all that is going on here is a relationship between architecture and the body. What is fundamentally important is that the move from Vitruvius and Alberti onwards is a move from the idea of the body as a unified, ordered site to another way of thinking the body. Equally, in the move away from the architectural, instead of seeing the analogy between building and body, where the building is an ordered, maintained site given within symmetry and eurythmy, that the move away from that is towards another type of architecture that has its correlate with that other thinking of the body. The difficulty is thinking how this movement takes place. The move from this initial setup to the contemporary is not, however, the move from the unified body to the affirmation of disjecta membra, the fragmented and disrupted body. The architectural correlate would have to run through these differing possibilities. In other words, that the move away from unity, the setup given to us by Vitruvius and Alberti, is not towards simply a shattering or pulverization of the body with its architectural correlate. It's to think of another notion of the fragmentary, of another notion of a belonging together that is not bound up with some idea of unity which controls and synthesizes the whole. It is rather than the place of exactitude, understood here as conciliation, as resolution. There would need to be a different understanding of unity, and thus of an architectural, therefore bodily, belonging together. Disruption in the fragmentary will only be there in terms of another belonging together. The way in which this would have to be pursued would be in terms of a project of having to think the relationship between the architectural and what could perhaps be described as the exigency of the fragmentary. As such, the fragment would no longer be opposed to unity. Once their specificity, the individual determinations of unity in the fragmentary, have to be thought outside of the structure of contradiction, then thinking the relationship between architecture and the fragmentary becomes a project that will of necessity demand an inaugural repetition and thus a renewal of thinking, because we usually take the opposite of unity to be disruption. We usually take the opposite of unity to be pure fragmentation. It's quite clear that the idea of pure fragmentation would be nihilism within architecture. Equally, pure fragmentation would be nihilism within philosophy, two forms of indulgent naivety. It seems to me that what has to be done then is to think through a more complex sense of fragmentation, and therefore of different understanding of how the fragmented belongs together. I'll return to this point. Pursuing this point would entail recognizing that rather than the tradition of moving between the unitary and the fragmentary, what would have become productive was their already imbricated or overlapping presence. One would have already been part of the other. It'll be vital to return to this productive formalism. Staying with the body, it may be that the possibility of this site, a site other than that of an already present completion, has already been gestured at by Georges Bataille. In some, it is a question of that which revolves around the sick tooth. What is the architecture, though equally what is the philosophy, after the sick tooth? I quote from Bataille. Beyond all knowledge, there is non-knowledge, and the one who would be absorbed in the thought that beyond his knowledge he knows nothing, even were he to have within him Hegel's inexorable lucidity, would no longer be Hegel, but a painful tooth in Hegel's mouth. Would a sick tooth alone be missing from the great philosopher? What Bataille is gesturing at here, and this needs some sort of background, is the following. That in Bataille's book, The Inner Experience, in the section on Descartes and the section on Hegel, Bataille identifies that part of the project of architecture and part of the project of philosophy was the exercise of complete mastery, and which he identifies with the word knowledge, the savoir. And he says that the project of knowledge has to exclude both the yet to be completed and non-knowledge, the non-savoir, from its formulation. And then he shows by a series of delicate textual moves that all philosophy can ever do, and this will equally be true for architecture, is inscribe within itself that which it cannot master. In the same way, within psychoanalysis, I suppose, the ego has a desire for mastery that it can never live out. Philosophy and architecture equally have a desire for mastery, but in their attempt to exercise, to unleash that mastery, they end up inscribing that which they cannot master within the project. And in the analysis of Descartes and Hegel, this inscription of the non-savoir, or the inachevé, is shown. And therefore what this does is check the project of mastery. So when Bataille in this text asks, would a sick tooth alone be missing from the great philosopher? What he's suggesting is that is all that is lacking from the project of mastery the affirmed presence of the unmasterable within it. Now architecturally, as well as philosophically, this has enormous consequences, because what it does do is indicate, as I'm going to suggest, that the real problem that appears here is that does the form of mastery and the inscription of the unmasterable within the masterable, are they identical? Or is there an architecture proper to that which bespeaks the presence of the unmasterable? Is there an architectural form proper to this lack of mastery, where lack is taken as a positive description? Here it is a question of housing the sick tooth, or perhaps beginning with the possible reality of all of its already having been housed. What then of this tooth? A way of reading Bataille's question is to give it greater range. It is not absolutely central that it be restricted to Hegel. His mouth, however, must be the initial point of departure, since what is raised is the presence of lack. In regards to Hegel, the question of the tooth turns on the possibility that what was lacking from the project of absolute knowledge was the inscription, the coming to terms with lack. Within Bataille, there is the recognition of the impossibility of the project of complete knowledge, absolute knowledge, and thus the finality of epistemological exhaustion. Arguing for that recognition has become the province of philosophy, once philosophy is no longer envisaged as the work of system. Here, of course, it is quite clearly a question of in response to this, what needs to be thought as a way of departing from system, and therefore a way of thinking about plurality. Here, of course, it is quite clearly a question of the nature of the plurality that works within building philosophy. In other words, it is not plurality itself that will be of concern, but the way plurality works by holding a metaphysics of the essence to one side. Again, this means no more than holding to one side the idea of a determined, pre-given arche governing the tectonic. What will be at work are other openings. What is at stake here is not a critique of the essentials per se, but an attempt to pluralize the essence, and in so doing to allow the sites, architecture, philosophy, to have opened up. They will become the differing topoi, containing differing topoi, in which the play of conflicting identity will be acted out. The continuity of its being acted out, the acting out of the continuity of identity and conflict, will in the end comprise the identities of both philosophy and architecture. As such, it will set the scene in which the question of their relation will need to be posed. I mean, very simply, and again schematically, if you would want to argue, as I would, that there is an essence to architecture, and the essence of architecture is shelter, then you can either argue that sheltering has a form, has one form, and there is sheltering per se, or what the word sheltering denotes is a series of irreconcilable and irreducible possibilities. Once that can be argued for, at that particular moment, what is essential, what is fundamental philosophically, is to allow for that being the case. And to allow for that being the case is to allow for the idea of the essential as marking an unmasterable and irreducible site that's there from the beginning. And that unmasterable and irreducible site that's there from the beginning is another way of formulating what Bataille and Blanchot call désœuvrement. These openings ought not to be given the force of having provided any new foundations. To the extent that désœuvrement plays a productive role, then not only would this hypostasize the negative, it would also fail to recognize that what is involved cannot be thought in terms of excluding either or. That is, either there is unity, or there is the disruption of the all occurring because of a sustained fragmentation of the given. Indeed, the contrary will be the case, since what emerges is the difficult possibility that production will always need to be accounted for in terms of the inscription of that which issues does without mastery. Whether it be given in terms of the consequence of thinking Bataille's conception of poetry or the role of negativity in Blanchot, what will have to be pursued is the way this generates a conception of production as well as practice that resists the hold of a founding arche, precisely because the tradition of the arche brings with it a conception of priority, incorporating both evaluation and time, that is no longer appropriate to any account of production. It should not be thought, however, that the force of this position can only be attributed to the proper names Bataille and Blanchot, since it is not only the case that architecture could come to be informed by other complex conceptions of presence and transformation, necessitating a similar type of thinking, it is also true that what is of central importance here is the thinking in question. And again, this becomes the province of the philosophical difficulty. It is not so much of positing that there should be another way, there could be another way, there is another way. That's easy. Positing is always easy. The difficult question is, how would one think another notion of the essence? How would one think the idea of an irreducibility that marks the question of shelter? And it seems to me that the moment those questions are raised, then the relationship between architecture and philosophy becomes more insistent, because it's precisely that question that also inheres in the architectural. There are, however, counterpositions, always, other responses to the presence of this nagging tooth. It is worth noting elements of these other possibilities. The first concerns the response to the impossibility of eliminating an inscribed unmasterability, while the second becomes the promulgation of that conception of invention which attempts to counter the impossibility of mastery, with a formulation of developments that fail to take the question of time into consideration. The first position concerns the possibility of either lament or melancholia. I mean, we see this all the time in a lot of philosophical writings. They begin along the lines of, given that it is impossible to, or given that it is no longer possible to. And then there is a lament about the situation in which we find ourselves. There is a melancholic aspiration or desire for what used to be there, where what used to be there can no longer be stated. Rather than a recognition of the productive potential of the negative, loss becomes linked to a lament for mastery, or a more generalized melancholia, in which thinking becomes pervaded by the work of an unspecified loss. From this position, philosophy and architecture become enmeshed within the emergent need to dwell aporetically. It is vital here that the aporetic is not read as an emotional, let alone a moral state. In the same way as countering lament with affirmation should not be interpreted as counterposing melancholia and joy. Affirmation is more demanding. Fundamentally, it is the asserted presence of another and thus different form of realism. In other words, that what I would suggest, though I can't argue for it in detail here, is that to argue for the incomplete, to argue for the unmasterable, to champion a form of impotence, as it were, is not to counterpose joy to melancholia. It's to counterpose the existence of an insistent complexity to that which laments the idea of unity, or laments the loss of unity. There is nothing joyful, necessarily, in the affirmative. What's being argued is not an emotional or psychological state of affairs. An important connection exists between the attempt to counter loss and the failure to allow the question of time to be taken as having a determining effect, both on the presentation of philosophy and the formulation of program within architecture. Leaving to one side, at this stage, the reality of built time, the time at work and effective within buildings' structuration, the time in question is twofold. In the first place, it is the one in which the constraints of theory are given. From one perspective, the work of theory orientates itself around a given object that is reproduced through time, such that the continuity of an informed vision maintains the work of theory, because the continuity of the object, and thus the inherent continuity of the time through which can be taken to unfold, are simply given. This will be the standard metaphysical construal of what theory is. Theory, both in an etymological sense and in the more contemporary version, refers to a vision that contemplates, views, accompanies, or runs alongside its object. What is precluded from this formulation is the possibility that the division between vision and object, for example, once subject to analysis or investigation, would cease to be theoretical, since there would no longer be the founding division on which the continuity of theory depends. It's precisely with that recognition that it is possible then to develop architectural theory. In other words, it's not a question of theorizing architecture or providing a theory of architecture, but to recognize that theory already is a relationship between a subject and an object that can't be simply accepted or taken over to core. Itself, it needs to be thought through. While it need not be the case that vision refers to an ideal object, it may be taken as referring to a sight which is given a singular or unified nature. As such, what arises is the necessity to take up the time of such an object. What is meant by this particular intrusion of time is both the way in which the object is able to be historical, and thus the way in which it works to sustain the inception of its being historical. Now, there are many different permutations that occur here. Working within most will be the recognition that theory must address the essential, assuming that the essential is unified in nature. This is what guides so-called theory. Hence, the essential is either at hand, we can see it in what's there, and thus, hence the essential is either at hand and is thus already present in any instantiated form, it's just out there, or the essential is not at hand, and thus must be uncovered within complex determinations that mark out the present. The distinction drawn by Heidegger in building-dwelling thinking between what he there calls today's housing shortage and what he describes elsewhere in the same text as the proper plight of dwelling maintains and depends upon this distinction. The recovery of a founding propriety generates one specific philosophical and architectural task. What happens once it is assumed that all that there can be is the housing shortage, the possibility of propriety has vanished. In other words, what Heidegger's work gives us, and it's there beautifully capsulated in Norberg Schulz's writings, Utilizing Heidegger, Norberg Schulz's analysis of Kahn's work, Utilizing Heidegger, is that the distinction you're forced to take with Heidegger is either that what is essential is not at hand, it has to be uncovered through an exact reading such that it comes to presence. There's either that or there's just simple facticity. And Heidegger's position forces us to oscillate between the two. In other words, if we're working within Heidegger's frame of reference, either there is an essence that is yet to be uncovered and the job is to uncover it, or there is just simple facticity, simple problems with housing. I'm suggesting that we needn't be caught within this either-or. The switch that occurs in this instance would be to that situation in which architecture did not have to engage with any particular formulation of the essence. And if we rejected Heidegger's conception of the essence, all we'd have would be a concern with building. Where this leaves the activity of architecture is with that theoretical position that generates a certain pragmatics of building. Building as the effect of a practice rather than as the consequence of architecture. And it's ironic, though rather sad, that, and this pertains to perhaps the architectural thinking behind the new Tate Gallery, is that what is happening with the demise of architectural theory is the championing of elegant and beautiful building. In other words, that building seems to be taking the place of architecture as the concern of architects. As an effect, this result mirrors the position that arises once unmasterability is equated with the impossibility of a critical or disruptive architecture. In other words, the move from architecture to building is equally a move that says it is no longer possible to have a critical or disruptive architecture, let alone a critical or disruptive architectural building. All there is left is elegance as the fag end of a certain conception of modernism. In this case, however, it would be the failure to link architectural practice to repetition, and thus to the movement of historical time, that led to the abandoning of architectural thinking. Returning the need for thinking returns the question of the essence to history. Here, of course, history is not just that which is given by periodization and dates, but the already given nature of what determines the place of activity. History is the place of the present. The present will frame the question of the essence once the history of the essential has been subdued. And what I mean by that is precisely this. If you take, for example, if you had as a project, just pluck something from the air, you wanted to design a museum of modern art, for example, and you were told that one of the things you needed to do was think about the quote-unquote national question, the national collection. and you were given a description of the modern as that which began in roughly 1895. Then you would have a number of things that could guide your thinking. You could say that historical time is chronological. It is the movement from 1895 to now. Therefore, the spine within the building, as it were, must bespeak the presence of chronological time. The divisions, the ribs, as it were, breaking off the spine or dropping off the spine, must articulate the various divisions within chronological time. If you thought about the national question as being something to do with Englishness, then painting that the modern gallery housing the national collection would house a certain conception of Englishness going from 1895 to now. But if it was thought within the structure of chronological development, it was thought through the structure of continuity, it was thought through the idea of there was such a thing as a synthesized and unified culture, then in the same way as that question, that response to the national question, the question of the national collection, couldn't take up what I'll refer to at the end of my paper as the diasporization of national cultures. Equally, the museum could not take up a more complex notion of time other than that of chronological time. However, we live in a situation in which chronology is thought to be natural, thought to be normal, and therefore thought to be that which guides the structure of a museum. We live in a situation in which what is thought to be fundamental is the idea of an essential culture, nuanced at the sides, but nonetheless reproduced from 1895 to the present, and therefore a museum of modern art must articulate that either innocently or affirmatively or aggressively. And it seems to me that once you allow for the question of history to emerge, and the question of history here is the disruption of that setup, because the disruption of that setup would be to view it as historical rather than as normal, rather than as natural. It's at that particular point, this disruption of the essence, that you would allow for not simply the more complex architecture, but there would be equally the demand for a more complex form of thinking. I've written, it is vital to be clear here. There is no attempt on my part to argue against the essence, as though the essential were merely that which gave itself in terms of singularity and unity. The essential will need to be recovered from precisely that conception in which singularity and unity dominated the way it came to be formulated. In such a move, the essential would be pluralized. Though again, the question would concern the nature of the plurality. The same point can be made in relation to propriety or authenticity, in the precise sense that arguing against the sense of propriety given by Heidegger to dwelling is not to argue against authenticity, and thus by extension for a fall into inauthenticity. Once their reciprocity is noted, then the shift that will occur is a distancing of that in terms of which this distinction, authentic, inauthentic, is itself to be thought. Furthermore, arguing against a specific form of the proper is not then to identify dwelling with the empirical presence of houses, and therefore with the literal presence of buildings. What emerges is an opening up of the question of the essential. Here an important connection emerges between the essential and the necessity of maintaining that conception of identity as identity in conflict. The direct consequence of this is that it becomes pointless to identify, or not to identify, the place of the architectural within the practice of philosophy as already specific, and thus as formally determined, because such a move must already presuppose the fixed identity of both philosophy and architecture. Indeed, that point could be developed, as I've done, as a rejoinder to the way in which Mark Wigley, for example, sets up the relationship between philosophy and architecture. In other words, the question that endures concerns how identity is to be thought, rather than taking over the assumption of identity, that we know what philosophy is, that we know what architecture is, and therefore we can just plot their interconnection. The pragmatics of identity have not been precluded. What they demand is a return to identity as a question. It is in terms of such a conception of identity, delimited by the structure and temporality of the question, that it will become possible to return to the detail of Blanchot's opening formulations concerning contradiction, and equally to understand why he ends the passage with the assertion that whatever is involved in such a complex setup, it is not, quote, a question of dialectics. what emerges from having dealt with other responses to the sick tooth, one of melancholia, and the other that hovers between a singular essence and the reversion to the activity of building, is that they fail to engage with the questioning that the tooth's presence actually occasions. If you inscribe the unmasterable within that which bespeaks mastery, how do you think their co-presence? The absence of dialectics, the positing of a contradiction without an envisaged conciliation, generates neither lament nor a dramatic search for the essence. On the contrary, it involves a return to the presence of time, I would argue. While this may seem an arbitrary injunction, after all, what would time be here? It is clear that time works these two other possibilities. Melancholia demands the attempted recovery or the overcoming of loss. It demands, in other words, the gradual effacing of that particular form of the present in order that the consequence of loss can be changed and that a type of recovery can be planned. Here architecture is implicated in a form of social healing. There would be no attempt to take up the problematic presence of loss as an architectural possibility. In its place would be the long-term attempt to efface its presence, with an architecture that obliterated its need by the counterforce of renewal, a spiritual renewal. Furthermore, the purported oscillation, a movement held and articulated by the logical structure of an either-or, between a unitary essence and what would be presented as the pure pragmatics of building, is implicated in an additional oscillation. Here it is between a process of recovery that effaces the present. Note, after all, Heidegger's use of the term today in the expression today's housing shortage, in the opposition between the everyday and the authentic or the proper, and the positing of a more primordial time. In other words, that Heidegger's own position between uncovering an essence that's been hidden and pure facticity, the everyday, is itself already the articulation of a temporal opposition between a primordial time and a pragmatic time. What would define the latter, this primordial time, is that it is a time outside of the time of the everyday. I mean, with Heidegger's position, in the end, what you have is a denigration of the everyday and a denigration of the ordinary because of its inability to speak to that which is primordial. The primordial and the everyday are held, therefore, in a reciprocity, where the identity of one arises out of its opposition to the other. It is possible, therefore, in the light of these identifications, to return to the position established by Blanchot between mastery and the presence of a slipping away of calculation and production, and thus the effect, though equally the affect, of another form of absence. Rather than a formation, there is the groundlessness of formation, the form of a generative formlessness. While the detail of this position cannot be pursued here, and this because rather than pursue it in the abstract, it would need the continual presence of specific architectural practices. Once the generative is thought outside of an inexorable teleology of construction, then the arche no longer has its absolute hold on the tectonic. What becomes important are not just looser relations and inexact connections, but their relation to program and appearance. The problematic presence of appearance will need to be taken up at a later stage. In order to proceed, it is vital to rescue the possibility of a generative formlessness from a series of distancing maneuvers that would move between the charge of obfuscation on the one hand and the accusation of irrelevance on the other. You may be thinking, this is just talk. What relevance does it have to architecture? I share this for a moment. What, after all, do these difficult and paradoxical formulations have to do with architecture, no matter how the latter is thought? Without opting for too truncated a response to this question, the answer hinges, as an opening, on how the negative is to be understood. In the case of the ostensibly literary, this question is not as difficult as it seems. When Blanchot is writing about Mallarmé, in attempting to explicate what he describes as the work of absence, he articulates the productive power of the negative in the following terms. It is a passage that has already been noted. I quote, "When there is nothing, it is the nothing that can no longer be denied, which affirms again, calls the nothing as being, the unworking of being. And if you think once again this seems extraordinarily arcane, not absolutely relevant, it's well worth thinking about this possibility, that Blanchot writing about poetry, Bataille writing about poetry, do not position poetry, a la Heidegger, as containing within it that which it cannot say. But they write about poetry as responding to that which they cannot master, as responding to what they call impossibility. But the interesting thing about the opposition possibility and impossibility is that we work with the idea that we can negate the impossible and establish the possible. We work with the idea that if there is something negative, which is the im of impossible, it's a simple matter of negating it. And in negating it, establishing something possible, something is fixed. What they're allowing for when he says, when there is nothing, it is the nothing that can no longer be denied, which affirms and firms again. It's that the im of impossible cannot be negated, so that poetry is the continual response to that which language cannot master. But that question of the lack of mastery is not inscribed as a lack or a loss within the work of poetry, so poetry can only lament what it cannot master. There is another way of thinking that relationship, and this is what this formulation is attempting to express. In Bataille's inner experience, in his celebrated digression on poetry, he defines the latter as the move from the known to the unknown. The sacrifice of the referent and the expectation of usage occur in a relentless drive towards the yet to be defined. This is the space of the literary. Sacrifice and thus poetry are opposed in Bataille's writings to the law, to morality, in some to what he describes as project. And yet the opposition is not absolute. And this is why, this is what is so fundamentally important about this position, this is why it is not pure nihilism. It's not saying no to law, no to mastery, no to these formulations. It is an engagement. And it's an engagement thought through désœuvrement. In the same way as désœuvrement will be operative and thus present as workful within work, poetry understood as the negative, the power of the unknown, will demand its own presentation and its being present within words, within the very words that are the place of project. In other words, in the very language that comprises law, that comprises morality, the very use of the material presence of writing, which is language itself, or the material presence of language, which is writing itself. Within both, poetry has to draw upon that which is already there. It is not a simple negation of what is already there. Bataille articulates this position with disarming clarity, and I quote, "The plan of moral is the plan of project. The contrary of project is sacrifice." So you think, aha, we've got it. We have moral on the one hand, project on the other hand, and against this we have sacrifice, we have poetry, we have transgression. And it looks like a simple either-or. If it's a simple either-or, then it's the naive work of nihilism. And then he adds, sacrifice takes on the form of project. So you're already halfway with the problem. Sacrifice looks as though it's written in the language of project. But then he adds the question, the difficult part, but only in the form of appearance. I quote again, "The plan of moral is the plan of project. The contrary of project is sacrifice. Sacrifice takes on the form of project, but only in appearance." And this seems to me the key question both architecturally and in the writing of philosophy. These two moments, working within a concern for the literary, reach beyond themselves. They call attention to that which works the possibility of presentation itself, of the concrete presence of program, if you will. In this context, this has two direct consequences. Consequences, it should be added, that are precisely what the passage intends. The first is the impossibility of pure destruction, the nihilistic gesture that is also found in the promulgation of complete fragmentation. Equally, however, it opens up the possibility of defining alterity in terms of an engagement with appearance. The questions arising here not only concern what is meant by appearance, the questions arising but whether or not the presence of poetry or sacrifice mediates appearance. In the latter case, appearance would no longer be merely appearance. There is a final moment that is essential before returning to what here will be the ostensibly architectural. In other words, the question that arises is this.
is that what, on a very elementary level, would be the distinction between project and sacrifice having the form of project, but only in appearance. Would there be any way of thinking the difference? If you flip that around and run it through architecturally, the question would be this: what is the distinction between a building in which form follows function, for example, and one in which that was the appearance, but something else was at stake? I mean, would there actually be any difference? In other words, the real problem that philosophy and architecture both have, because they are both, as I've said, argued many times, both fundamentally conservative disciplines, in the precise sense that they conserve. They conserve, their architecture conserves the telos of shelter by sheltering. Philosophy conserves its own tradition by repeating it. Both these traditions are marked by a repetition that's dominated by the idea of sameness. Given that that's the case, and it's inexorably the case, it's inevitably the case, one confronts it everywhere, one confronts philosophy and architecture, and given that there has to be a repetition, the telos of architecture must be repeated in order that it be architecture, etc., etc. The fundamental question is this: what is it like to intervene within that repetition? What is it like to repeat such that there is a repetition that takes place again for the first time? And it seems to me that is the question that philosophy has to engage with. Equally, it's the question that architecture has to engage with, but both engage with it from within their own traditions. In a text called Cora, Derrida's homage to Jean-Pierre Vernant, his opening concern is the productive potential of what he describes as a space without space, a place without an automatic and thus autonomous site. That is the site of Cora. Its importance concerns its effect on what is produced, and thus the overall estimation of that project. Having already cited and worked through the opposition between logos and mythos, Derrida asks, once again, it's the same question, but it's the fundamental question that we saw with Bataille. It's this: how is one to think the necessity of that which, while giving place to that opposition as to many others, seems sometimes to be itself no longer subject to the law of the very thing which it situates? What of this place? Is it nameable? And Derrida, true to his own project, is keen to find that which is productive, but is not inscribed within and mastered by what it produces. And here, if one was going to do this in detail, which I'm not, it would be vital to work through the detail of Derrida's own text, tracing perhaps its effect within contemporary architectural practice. And its effect within contemporary architectural practice is as much on Peter Eisenman's work as it is on Derrida's own engagement with Libeskind's project, where the critique of Libeskind's project has to do with how the question of the void is understood. At this stage, however, the question that arises concerns the structural effect of Cora. What is the relationship between the oppositions to which it gives rise and Cora? Is the only appearance of Cora the oppositions that dominate the tradition of philosophy, or will there be another way of thinking that relation? Finally, is Cora just one? Is there the possibility that in any site there will be the plethora of Cora? In the first instance, what these questions refer to is the risk that endures within any attempt to rethink the arche, or to find another generative principle, even one detailing the power of the negative. The risk is this: it is that all that will have taken place in such a move is merely replacing one productive or generative moment with another. The problem is appearance. Will appearance be the same? What is an appearance? It is at this precise point that the literary, the philosophical, and the architectural coincide. What marks the site will demand attention be paid to the specificity of architecture as much to the specificity of literature and philosophy. What is an appearance within architecture? What is an appearance within philosophy? What is an appearance within literature? Each time the question is posed, it insists. Each time it is taken up, what is taken up will be different. As has already been intimated, Bataille's recognition of the necessary retention of words, of order, of syntax and sentences needs to be understood initially as a defiant stand against nihilism. However, for Bataille's own undertaking, to be successful, this can be the only sense given to appearance. When he writes of les formes du projet, the forms of project, there is only one sense in which poetry can have this form, Again, the word form will engender the precise same problem. What has to be argued is that neither appearance nor form are either appearance or form if the latter are understood as merely surface effects. Rather, they denote the presence of an elementary materiality, words and their sustained unfolding. Indeed, it is at this precise point that it becomes possible to identify not the meaning of Bataille's own writings, but their signification, the latter signification being the relation that they have to their own material presence. As a book and as writing, the book Inner Experience works to escape the opposition of appearance and depth by producing from within itself the very openings, fissures, delays, and thus experiences that it attempts to present. Its own limits are the limits of its appearance. Neither on the level of form nor appearance does the book, the Inner Experience, appear as a book or work within the tradition of writing, despite its being a book and despite its being the work of writing. What appears, therefore, and this is my conclusion, what appears, therefore, cannot be automatically incorporated into a distinction between surface and depth. This position has significant consequences. The insistence on materiality means that the general claim concerning appearance cannot be generalized. It will already have been marked by a type of specificity. What this means is that appearance and form become almost local concerns. What becomes fundamental is allowing for the distinction between the form of project, and thus between poetry on sacrifice on the one hand and mere appearance on the other. Here the distinction will have to be thought in terms of its already involving a productive overlapping. Equally, it will be important to allow for the possibility that rather than orchestrating the presence of Cora as productive of the oppositions dominating the tradition of philosophy, it could occasion another philosophical thinking, perhaps by being its form. And once again, this seems to be the key point where philosophy and architecture come into touch each other. With that possibility that Cora, rather than simply being productive of the forms that mark what Derrida would call logocentrism, and therefore being the same as any other logocentric text, instead of doing that, there is the possibility that it could give rise to another form, another mode of being present. And yet, this is the rub, and yet, if it has to be accepted that the above-mentioned distinction demanded by Bataille's own undertaking, as well as the other eventuality for the work of Cora, are impossible, if there is only this form of appearance, then not only is philosophy condemned to the endless play of repetition thought within the confines of the same, but that architecture will also have been abandoned. Now it will have abandoned itself to the ceaseless work of building. The choice is relatively stark. Even though the way it will work within the practices of philosophy and architecture will always involve nuanced decisions and fragile openings, the distinction between the form of project and project is not there as an either-or. Working with their necessarily imbricated and overlapping presence means, in the first place, insisting on the force of materiality, and secondly, allowing for the particular nature of the distinction to be generated by the work's own work. In other words, by its own self-generating and self-affecting process of realization. The presence of a process of realization yields economies, in the same way as there will be an important distinction between the pure affirmation of the interplay of poetry and project and the simple presence of project. It will have to be possible to distinguish between an architecture of project and one in which there is a sustained negotiation with the question of appearance, and not, for example, as one would find in the elegant and beautiful work of Michael Graves, as pure appearance. As such, there is the impossibility of pure generality. Lacking generality is linked to the question of the essence. What this means is that rather than allocating to the essence a possible determination that is on the one hand unified in nature, while on the other withdrawn from the domain of facticity, the essential will become the setting of an architecture that works through the play of several constraints. What constrains architecture will be essential to its being what it is. The way in which those constraints are instantiated become the necessary localization of the architectural. The two working together will to continue to yield that which is essential to any architectural practice, by yielding a setup that is traversed by an insistent plurality, while at the same time generating the sight of judgment. What this amounts to is the claim that the essential will always allow for the divide that works within Bataille's construal of the distinction between poetry and project. While there has been a continual attempt to interarticulate the body and the urban, this is usually either done through a process of abstraction or the production of coherent totalities. The more emphatic relation would occur once both locations were taken as already sites of multiple investments, different speeds and times, plural determinations, all of which cohered in the same location. And it seems to me there's a whole, which I could take up later on, there's a whole urban project, or a way of thinking urbanism, in terms of the idea of differing speeds and times, plural determinations, cohering in the same location at the same time, where it's the question of time that generates complexity. What becomes, here the idea of sameness while appearing spatial, all at the same time. Here the idea of sameness while appearing spatial. After all, the initial formulation of any urban site will be its spatial coordinates, is in fact temporal. What becomes fundamental is the recognition that the force of plurality is given by the constitutive and irreducible parts cohering in their difference at the same time. Here the complexity in question does not lend itself to a single view. As such, theory will not accompany the object, because the object does not give itself to be seen as a complex that resists the totality of any purported optical immediacy. This state of affairs has little to do with size, and here one would need to take in Koolhaas's fascination with bigness. Writing of Berlin, writing it should be remembered in the 60s, Blanchot evokes the signification of the wall in the following terms, and I quote Blanchot: "The reality of the wall was destined to throw into abstraction the unity of the big city full of life, a city that was not and is not in reality a single city, not two cities, not the capital of a country, not any important city, not the centre, nothing but this absent centre. In this way the wall succeeded in concretizing abstractly the division, to render it visible and tangible, and thus to force us to think henceforth of Berlin in the very unity of its name, no longer under the sign of a lost unity, but as the sociological reality constituted by two absolutely different cities." The collapse of the, end quote, the collapse of the wall, its destruction by the citizens of Berlin, did it overcome this sociological reality, two cities? Or did it cause Berlin to become the exemplary city, insofar as the act of unification divided it again? And here one would need to take a lot more time, not simply studying Blanchot's own text, but thinking about the history of Berlin. No longer would the divide be in the middle. The division would be the inscription of a complex space that characterizes the city within this stage of modernity. It would be possible to continue this reworking of Blanchot's engagement with Berlin in order to argue that what appeared as clear-cut divisions now are divisions pertaining at one and the same time. Moreover, it would insist on the unmasterability of a space whose complexity is sustained by time, but which is held within an ontological and existential irreducibility. As such, it would be possible to have come full circle. Instead of exiling the division, which would be the idea of unifying the city, instead of exiling division, the city would become home once it was allowed that the diaspora was already there within its confines. Allowing home, allowing as home, the diasporization of the urban and the city will be to allow the productive potential of désœuvrement, the unmasterable generative process. It will be to allow it a home that it will share in all its guises, names and appearances within philosophy, literature and architecture. Architectural theory will emerge in this place as long as it does not remain blind to the fact that in its field of vision it will always have seen, and thus will always need to see, more than one. Thank you.
Sure, sure.
That was the first point. The second point, and it's only the second. There were certain themes running through, very interesting themes, that for me somehow got lost. For instance, now you mentioned the relationship between body and architecture, and you referenced Vitruvius and Alberti, that relationship, body and architecture, got lost towards the end. When you picked it up again, you spoke of body and urban, and you mentioned modern engagement with time. Well, I couldn't quite relate the later reference to body and architecture with the previous one.
Sure. Well, in regard to the second point, I mean, the Popper question is too difficult a question because it would take too long, but I'll allude to it at the end. In regard to the first point, I mean, that was, yes, you're right, questions of my hitting 6,000 words and thinking that that's already an hour, how much can they endure? What I was trying to say was very simply was this, is that the sort of thinking that one could bring to the question of the body, instead of just assuming that there is a body, now let's think it, and the sort of thinking that one would bring to the urban, there is an urban site, now let's think it, the sorts of ideas of complexity that I would want to bring can be brought to both. And in a fuller version of this, I suppose what I'd want to do is really develop the thinking of develop the conception of the body and the conception of the urban. And when I indicated the quote from Vitruvius, which is known to you all, is an attempt to sort of show that Vitruvius didn't think that there was a metaphorical relationship, that one was an analogue of the other. But as you know, and the same is true in Alberti, that it was marked by the idea of order and unity. Now, the opposite of order and unity is not disjecta membra, is not just the fragmented, blown-up, pulverized body. Therefore, and that's going to be true both for the thinking the body outside of unity and thinking the urban outside of unity. And what I was trying to do in the paper was gesture towards that mode of thinking which would allow for thinking the body as a complex site or thinking the urban as a complex site, whilst at the same time retaining the specificity of each. So I must admit I didn't flesh, as it were, the whole thing out.
Paul Ricoeur, in criticizing Marx and Freud for developing too complete systems that are too complete, insists on a hermeneutical tradition which has an opening to the future. And he tends, or he seems to put that opening to the future under the sign of hope. Do you think he goes too far?
Well, it's very interesting you say this. It's very interesting that Libeskind calls the Jewish Museum the extension, an architecture of hope. He says it's hopeful architecture. And I'm, too, very interested in hope. But what I would want to argue, and I can't argue it, I'll merely state it here, is that, in fact, what hope is precisely not an opening towards the future. It's maintaining the present as incomplete. And it seems to me that what Liebeskind's museum is going to do and is doing is, instead of answering the question, what does it mean to engage with loss in the age of mass death, given Berlin, given Berlin's history of Jews, etc., given that one doesn't want to work simply with a structure of lament or melancholia, but one wants the void in some sense to work productively. But how does one maintain that as a question? And it seems to me that the idea of the future is maintained as a condition of the present, to the extent that the architecture of the question or the idea of the architecture of the incomplete, I suspect, from my mind they're the same thing, are maintained as possibilities. And it seems to me that it's inscribing this idea of the incomplete as productive within a building's own effectuation as a building that becomes tremendously important. Another way of giving this another way of taking this with less pathos is to say this: if you contrast the 19th century shed to another possibility for shedding, for a shed. What's interesting about the 19th century shed is that if your 19th century shed is X meters long and you add Y, what you have is a shed that's X plus Y. that any addition is simply the addition of y to any pre-existing x. Now it seems to me, is there a way of thinking the possibility of shedding, of building a shed, in which the addition of y to x generates x plus y plus z? In other words, that there is the generation of another space, of a different sort of space, that comes out of and is not necessarily determined by the addition, but is the consequence of an addition. And it seems to me that there are specific practices, and here I'm thinking of a particular project for the Yokohama port terminal, in which this idea of shedding or development of the shed takes place. Now once again, this is not the idea of a necessary unmasterability. What it is the idea that what occurs in the addition to something, the thing itself becomes self-generative. And to that extent, while this obviously is predictable to the extent that its having occurred means it could have been predicted and therefore it can be built, it would be a different way of generating space. So there would be the inscription, if you like, of an unmasterable element or a non-predictive element, an element that emerged out of a loose relationship between the arcane and the tectonic within it. Now, it's too difficult to link the shed to hope, but what is interesting is the idea that even with these very elementary examples, one can think of projects that allow for the eruption of a space that is a consequence, but not a consequence of something that is simply additive. And to that extent, it becomes possible to draw connections, always allowing for specificity, between different architectural projects, where what is interesting about them is that they work in relation to the idea of the unpredictable or the unmasterable. And I would say that to the extent that that's retained, once again always allowing for specificity, one retains the structure of hope.
I'd like to ask you a kind of philosophical, a psychoanalytic question. Normally, when one's going to ask someone a psychoanalytic question, you listen for the term in their paper which they gloss and gloss and gloss. It's a bit like a sort of symptom because they can't quite gloss it. But I think that's not the case with philosophers. With philosophers, you listen for the term which slipped by unglossed throughout a paper which was quite prepared to gloss other things. I'd single out the term shelter. With its kind of philosophical baggage. It seems to me, I mean, not just that you didn't gloss the term shelter. It's inexorably kind of transitive. It's like shelter for a human body, and that seemed like the couple upon which the argument is kind of assembled. Now, the real question is, in a way, is about, well, there are two stages to the question. The first is, that seems to me to commit you to talking about architecture through a series of fundamental singularities. Something like one building, then another, one project, then another, and actually at variance at the end with the sudden invocation of urbanism. That's kind of one thing. Secondly, it seems to me unclear what this category of the body is. On the one hand, you want to distinguish it from the Vitruvian or Albertian kind of body. But in fact, these seem to me no more than, from a contemporary point of view, manic images. Not of a human reference to dwelling, but rather what I'd call like a sort of manic defense to maintain certain forms of coherence, representability, repetition, whatever. Perhaps kind of embodied in certain kinds of neoclassical style. So somehow, it felt to me that these these are kind of desperately vulnerable terms, like the body and shelter, and yet function like as the unglossed
Yes, well,
bit of the paper.
I'm so fascinated by the word gloss, because the idea of gloss would be to give something a shiny veneer. But what I was doing was an enormous shorthand. I mean, I've just finished working on something that argues the following: is that why? In fact, I think I alluded to this as an aside. That while I would want to argue that the telos of architecture, or the essence of architecture, is shelter, and while I would agree with you absolutely that cannot be thought outside its relationship to the sheltered, so you have an automatic shelter-sheltered relationship. At that particular point, having said that, you have got both everywhere and nowhere. You've got everywhere because you've identified what is essential, what is repeated in architecture as being architecture. But then the really interesting question comes up of in terms of what or how do you think it? And at that particular point, the rest of the argument is meant to swing in to say that there is no such thing as shelter in and of itself. There is no such thing as the shelter-sheltered relationship in and of itself. That the very arguments for plurality or complexity, no matter how I'd want to articulate them, pertain equally to that interrelationship as it does to everything else I've argued. And therefore what becomes the philosophical question, which I think I alluded to time and time again, is that is it possible to think the idea of the essential, and I'm using this very old-fashioned language, but I'll stick to it for the moment, is it possible to think the idea of the essential, and here it would be the sheltered relationship, outside of the necessary determinations of unity and singularity that are that are given by the philosophical tradition in order to think the essential. Now that's the question that I started with. It's equally the same question that I would address to the body. It's equally the same question I'd address to the urban. That these things do not, outside of positing, exist in and of themselves. The question is, how is it that they come to be thought? Or how is it that they can be thought? And so I don't know whether we would agree or disagree, but I would want to hold to the shelter-sheltered relationship, both as a rhetorical move, to say that's the essence, but then to come back and say, then the interesting question is how you think the essence. So I would want to, in some sense, hold to it, but to say that what is a real philosophical possibility is another mode of essential thinking. And then it goes back to something I alluded to time and again, I thought within the paper, as this formulation I use, I'm sure others have used as well, which is identity and conflict. And that is to argue that instead of there being such a thing as a word naming its referent, so the word designates or identifies its referent in any absolute sense, that what there is in regards to identity is precisely a conflict, and by that I mean simply a sight of a founding irreducibility over what it means to hold to that identity. And that, I think, works in urbanistic terms. If you want to say that what marks out the urban at the moment is what I've called the diasporization of the city. In other words, or the diasporization of the urban. In other words, instead of seeing the urban as the home and there's an outside, to say that what's already at work is some idea of a setup that is both self and other, home and outside, as already constitutive of the inside. And the question is, once again, is how you think that particular setup. Now, I don't know whether, I think that's what I was getting at, and I didn't, develop these terms in great detail because I think more interested, I suppose, in this particular instance of staking out the territory, as it were, in which they can be thought. No, because I'm trying to be, successfully or not, I'll leave as an open question. I'm trying to be as as disruptive as possible by saying that theory is a relationship between a subject and an object. But the moment, and it's a relationship given in terms of vision. But once you say that, then that's not all you can say. And the moment you say that, you have to then not hedge it as though there was one thing you then hedged. You then have to say, and what that forces us to do is take up then the relationship between subject, object, what it means by vision, etc., etc. Let me give you a very clear example from art. In modernist painting, Greenberg argues that what marks out the modernist painting is that it's given he used this expression of its at-onceness, his formulation. In other words, the work gives itself at once to be viewed at once. So the notion of a Greenbergian conception of opticality is governed by the idea of at-onceness. So the work must be such that it can be given at once. Now, a relation between a subject and an object and the idea of opticality is inscribed within it. This is the ground of theory. But is one's response to Greenberg the question is, how does one respond to this situation? And what I would argue in regard to this is not that Greenberg is sort of wrong that it's a subject-object relationship. Where there is a sort of paucity in the argument, as it were, is in the ontology of the artwork as reducible to that which can be given at once. So in other words, one accepts the framework on one level and immediately mediates it by saying that what is precluded by Greenberg's notion of at-onceness, and hence the whole Greenbergian theory of opticality, is precisely the idea that the work could be a complex sight and thus not be able to be viewed at once. And once you argue that, and once you then say there is a link between the vision and opticality in theory, then theory is no longer one thing. But theory must allow for the possibility that it lends that there is at-onceness, which one can show to be spurious, or you can say there is a more complex notion of opticality that in some sense must accord with the idea of a more complex object. So and that's why I ended my my paper by saying that, you know, that architectural theory emerges as long as it recognises it will always have seen, and thus will always be need to see more than one. And so it's not that theory is a shelter, but this idea of pure opticality, at Greenbergian at-onceness, is no longer apposite.
Excuse me, I just want to kind of resolve it. On the one hand,
What do you-
you could insist on this relationship with the theory of the subject and the object, and kind of want to bring it like together. But then ultimately, when you kind of get into the argument, you kind of ultimately want to see this kind of complex object, which you called just now again. And also, it seems to me in the presentation you referred to it when you were talking about this shelter and then something that could be added to it, and then perhaps it will generate a new kind of X, Y, Z.
No, that wasn't the shelter, that was the shed. I was specifically talking about the 19th century shed.
That was the shed that would give a new quality. But it seems to me, as it were, the hope was always on your behalf, somewhere where the object was. Also appears in the argument when you were discussing Cora, when you were sort of asking for the new, as it were, architecture, you were almost sort of saying it should be like Cora-like. But you were rather understanding it as a kind of new complex object, what you just said it at the end, rather than, as it were, a new kind of experience, as it were, of the object, which ultimately could be the same.
Well, yeah, okay. I am very, very, I know this argument.
Within your own theory, if it kind of relates, if it in a way relies on this relationship, it would allow for that.
Sure. I'm prepared to...
Let me put a sort of supplementary question. I mean, my question, well, it's not a question actually, it's an objection.
Fine.
To the argument. It's that you lend dignity to what happens in the world, and you shouldn't.
No, I think that I'm precisely not. That I mean, I am now very. In fact, I was reading a recent work on Mies that attempts to, you know, rescue Mies from a certain tradition by using a certain type of work that says, you know, there is the possibility of a new experience of this, so we don't have to experience it in the way it was done, and there is always this. And on one level, I'm never ever going to preclude, I mean, how could I, preclude that possibility of another experience of something. That I'm not precluding for a moment. What I am arguing for is precisely in relation to the object and precisely in relation to its complexity, but equally, and now I've not argued for it here, but equally I would argue that to the extent that one wants to hold to this subject-object relation, which I'm only doing, as I keep saying, rhetorically in order to get something going, I would equally want to argue that the subject's position in relation to this object is equally going to be subject to arguments concerning complexity as much as the object. It's not as though there is just this, sentient entity and things keep appearing in front of it. And indeed, part and parcel of, and this is where I would be, a straight old-fashioned avant-gardist stroke modernist, and sort of argue that what is fundamental to one's thinking about architecture is the question of experience. I mean, I've written about this, I've argued this, and I would flip this, what I've said tonight, around and say that what I'm interested in are moments of architectural possibilities in which to use sloganist language, language of slogans. You could say that while one is aware that architecture is taking place, what is opened up as a question is precisely how is it architectural? And rather than lending dignity to the world, I'd want to say that given that 99% of architecture doesn't do that, what does interest me is the 1% of architecture. So I am very then suspicious of redeeming corporate modernism by saying, well, look, if you look at it another way, it's pretty groovy. I just doubt this at all. And it's a possible argument, I accept this, because what I've tried to move time and time through this is this question of tradition, is this question of repetition, and you could take it, for example, as I've argued before, if you wanted to argue for another structure of the pedagogical, if you want to argue for another structure of the domestic, if one wanted to, then the really interesting question is where would it be housed? In other words, is there an interrelationship between the structure of pedagogy, the structure of domesticity, and its architecture? And it seems at that precise point, one has to say, we retain the telos of architecture, shelter. People have to live somewhere. There have to be educational institutions. But it doesn't follow from that. That the shift in our thinking about pedagogy, our shift in our thinking about the domestic, will have to have, even though that telos is retained, because it's retained rhetorically, will have to have the same form at all. And indeed, at that particular point, you have an opening in which it becomes possible to think other possibilities. But they can only be thought by retaining as central